The story of Sarah Ann Whitney, a teenage girl sealed to Joseph Smith as a plural wife in Nauvoo, can tell us a lot about the early Mormon practice of polygamy. It can also reveal a lot about the complexities of the archival record and the task of the historian's craft. In writing my book, Kingdom of Nauvoo, The Rise and Fall of a Religious Empire on the American Frontier, I was faced with the task of explaining the introduction, ideas, and practice of polygamy in a way that was both true to the historical record, fits into the broader historical context, but also captures the humanity of the historical experience. And few stories captured all those dynamics as well as Sarah Ann Whitney. So I thought I'd do a deep dive video on that particular story, walking through three important moments in Sarah Ann Whitney's sealing to Joseph Smith, July of 1842, August of 1842, and then March of 1843, and talk about the batch of documentary records that are connected to each of those moments. Records that both come from the period itself, as well as the period much later, and why all those archival records only make sense when they fit within this larger story, hoping to shed some light on the task behind the historian's craft, the man operating behind the curtain, so to speak. This is my weekly deep dive. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. Share the video if you like it. I try to provide this type of analysis of historical work to bring meaning to not just our tales of the past, but the path that brought us to the present. Let's dig in. Sarah Ann Whitney likely knew Joseph Smith most of her entire life. Her parents, Newell K. Whitney and Elizabeth Ann Whitney, were some of the earliest converts to the faith and became some of the most prominent members. Newell K. Whitney was one of the first bishops of the Mormon tradition, and Elizabeth Ann Whitney was a leader within the women's community, later the Relief Society, and she was known for speaking in tongues and her spiritual empowerment within the group. So in a sense, Sarah Ann Whitney was raised in Mormon royalty, but that faithfulness that had been tethered to that family was tested in the summer of 1842, because it appears it was during that time that Joseph Smith approached the family to tell them about plural marriage, an idea that he had already been teaching for a couple of years, though in haphazard ways. I try to dig in my book the varieties of development of polygamy starting in the summer of 1840 up until 1842, and then I talk about it later. But when Joseph Smith approaches Newell K. and Elizabeth Ann Whitney in the summer of 1842, he offers a audacious and quite scandalous proposition. He wanted to be sealed to their teenage daughter. Sarah Ann Whitney was 17 years old at the time. Here's a photograph of her from later on in her life. Now, we don't have the contemporary documents about their reaction, meaning the Whitney's reaction to it. We have later on, Elizabeth Ann Whitney talks about how she was shocked by the proposal, and in her words, it forced them to lay aside their expectations of what marriage would look like, both for their family, because eventually Newell K. Whitney would take on plural wives, as well as for their teenage daughter. What we do have as a documented record from near the time is this document, which is a part revelation, part letter and instruction from Joseph Smith to Newell K. Whitney. Now, this does not appear to be the original. Seems like it was copied, likely by Newell and Elizabeth's children at some point in the next few decades. There are textual clues that I'll get into later that make it clear that they are working from an original when they made this copy. But this text is dated July 27th, 1842. And it is the only record we have directly from Joseph Smith about how a polygamous sealing was performed, because it was instructing Newell K. Whitney on how to officiate the sealing between Joseph Smith and Sarah Ann Whitney, Newell K.'s 17-year-old daughter. It talks about how salvation is going to come to Sarah Ann through the lineage of the priesthood, that the entire Whitney family would be blessed, and it promised further blessings for the entire family. More on that in a bit. But this document is one of the most important we have that seem quite closely dated to the time. In fact, the original was probably created on July 27th, 1842, and then copied later on. That document remains, like the others I'm going to be discussing, in the Whitney family collection for decades, where we get references to these documents, but they're never publicized. So if someone were to argue that they're fraudulent, fraudulent to what end? They're not using them in public debates. They are kept in the family, as you might expect these documents to do. All right. And I think it's also important to note here, before I move on, that it's hard to say that Sarah Ann Whitney, the 17-year-old girl at the heart of the story, had much consent in the story. She's 17. It's her priesthood authority, the prophet Joseph Smith, approaching her family after some reluctance seem on board. And so make of that what you will, but it's hard to say that she was able to operate much agency and much say in that sealing that ends up shaping the rest of her life. So moving forward a couple weeks to August of 1842, Joseph Smith is now in hiding from the law. There is an arrest warrant issued against him. Missouri is trying to extradite him back to the state for him to stand trial, and so he is in hiding. And while he is in hiding, he writes this letter to the Whitneys. I'll provide high-resolution scans in the video descriptions where you can see these documents at the Joseph Smith Papers website. This letter, in Joseph Smith's own hand, is addressed to Newell, Elizabeth, and so on. And it's clear from the contents of this letter, the and so on was Sarah. And we'll get to some reasons why that's later. Joseph encourages the Whitneys to come visit him in their hiding place. He says that I have more blessings for you to receive. And he clearly states that you are to hide this letter, hide this visit from Emma. Now, some have argued that this is because the police and the authorities who are trying to arrest Joseph Smith are shadowing Emma, and so you don't want. So if you let Emma in on it, maybe others will find out. But he's still meeting with Emma in secret, so that doesn't really make sense. It makes sense that what they are doing would be scandalous to Emma, and that's why he's telling them to avoid letting her know. Further, he is promising them further blessings as a family. I'm going to get more on this in a moment. And then most importantly, he tells them to burn the letter as soon as you read it, and to keep the contents locked in your breast because my life depends on it. This demonstrates the secrecy that Joseph Smith instills on this secret rendezvous, and importantly, the contents, because he is meeting with a family, including a teenage girl that he was just sealed to. This also shows why we don't have a lot of contemporaneous records concerning polygamy, because he's telling people to burn those records. He knows the scandal that would come. He knows that, in his words, my life depends on it. Now, let me say for really quickly why we can tell this document is important for understanding the Revelation document that I mentioned before, the July 1842 document. The later transcripts of the July 1842 document, the Revelation, one of the few documents we have from Joseph Smith's voice on polygamy and how the polygamous sealing is done, it includes the blessings that Newell Kay and Elizabeth eventually receive after this August letter, meaning that the Whitney family kept these records together, and whatever child or relative or office worker eventually copies them into the July 1842 documents we have is working from those originals that became batched together. Maybe they were together in Newell K. Whitney's diary, and that he's not differentiating the ones from the other, but it's clear that these are just some of the textual clues we have that validate how they are working in tandem. This is the type of historical work that scholars try to do. It's also notable that it appears the Whitney family still has some hesitancy about what's going on, whether the hesitancy is coming from Sarah Ann, who again, we still can't really tell if she has much say in this, or the family in general, because 2 weeks after that August 1842 letter, Joseph Smith signs over a deed of property to Sarah Ann Whitney for a plot of land just about a block away from his. Now, here you have the deed of that taking place. It is hard to emphasize how rare it was for women in general to own land in Nauvoo, but a 17-year-old girl in particular. It's also notable that the Whitneys were actually already living on this land that had been owned by Joseph Smith. And so it seems like this is a financial transaction going on to assure the Whitneys that Sarah Ann and the Whitney family will be taken care of beyond just spiritual blessings. Why else would Joseph Smith be signing over a piece of land to Sarah Ann, the 17-year-old, and not the parents, other than these events that we can tease out from the other documents? So that takes us to the third period that I'm talking about in Nauvoo, which is March of 1843. Because despite the sealing, despite the land transaction, despite the further blessings that the Whitneys received, it still appears that Sarah Ann is facing some doubts, is having a hard time adjusting to this new stark reality that she does not have much of a say in. Further, she turns 18 in March of 1843, which typically implies reaching adulthood, although those descriptions are much more of a modern invention. But let me put it simply, it would be odd for a woman coming from a royal family in Nauvoo who is smart, good looking, well connected, not to be courted, not to receive lots of offers, but because she's secretly married to Joseph Smith, she is not able to take up those courtship opportunities. Meanwhile, her aunt, Caroline Whitney, dies while giving birth the previous fall. Her name was Caroline Whitney, and her husband, Joseph Kingsbury, is now a widower. So in March of 1843, there seems to be an agreed upon solution by Joseph Kingsbury, the Whitneys, and Joseph Smith to find a way to avoid the awkwardness of Sarah Ann Whitney remaining single. And that's that Sarah Ann and Joseph Kingsbury would be married in what Joseph Kingsbury called a pretended marriage. How do we know this besides the marriage certificate from April 1843? Well, we have two blessings given on the same day of March 23, 1843. Maybe the agreement came on that day. Let me talk about these documents in turn. One comes from very close to the date, and the other comes from what looks like the date itself. The first document comes from Joseph Kingsbury. Here you have an excerpt from his diary/history, which is written probably just a couple years after the event, and it includes the blessing that he receives from Joseph Smith. Because the question is, why would he agree to enter into this pretended marriage, his words, with Sarah Ann Whitney? Well, it appears that Joseph Smith promises him that in return for his faithfulness, he would be sealed to his deceased spouse, Caroline Whitney, for the eternities. The first example of a posthumous sealing in Mormon history. I actually argue that this is a much bigger deal in Nauvoo in the development of the understanding of sealings and polygamy. But put simply, here we have a blessing from Joseph Smith written in Joseph Kingsbury's diary/history, promising him blessings. And he gives a prefatory remark saying, this is in return for me entering this pretended marriage with Sarah Ann Whitney. The second document we have is this one. And this document comes from March of 1843. It is in Joseph Smith's own hand, and it is a blessing to Sarah Ann Whitney. We don't get many examples of blessings in Joseph Smith's own hand, which shows the secret nature of this. He's not wanting to take in his other scribes into this activity. He is keeping it close to the vest, close to the breast, to use his phrase from the 1842 August letter. And he writes out a blessing where, while staying coy on the details of what prompted this blessing, promises eternal salvation and exaltation to the entire Whitney family, providing a textual assurance of the blessings that had been performed at the sealing before. Sarah Ann Whitney keeps that blessing in her possession for most of her life. It remains a part of the Whitney core family documents, and it was actually secluded from archival records, which goes to show why it wasn't forged, right? It was, if they created this to justify polygamy later on, they would have trumpeted it, except they didn't. In fact, here's a fun story. Here's a picture of me finding out about the document when the LDS Church released it quietly on the Joseph Smith Papers website, being blown away because I immediately recognized the significance of how this fits within the larger story. So let's talk about a few lasting legacies. When Joseph Smith dies in June of 1844, Sarah Ann Whitney is still in her pretended marriage to Joseph Kingsbury, but later on she, like many other of Joseph Smith's plural wives, was divided up between Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball, and she becomes both the plural and the earthly spouse of Heber C. Kimball. Her pretended marriage was over. So why did it exist in the first place if not for covering up the sealing to Joseph Smith? She ends up bearing 7 children to Heber C. Kimball, and later on signs affidavits attesting to her not only being sealed to Joseph Smith, but attesting to the reality of those documents that remained in the Whitney family collection. Those documents became a core part of this Whitney family collection, one of the most important archival collections we have for early Mormonism. They attest both contemporaneously and later to the reality and the experiences of polygamy. So to put this in other words, both the contemporary records and the later reminiscences in this sense align very closely to the point of where these documents would not make sense without the broader story. The contextual record is clear about polygamy. But in making that case, it's also important to point out that they make clear the trauma that was inflicted and experienced by especially Sarah Ann Whitney during this whole ordeal, and that we must keep that humanity at the heart when we tell these stories. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like it and share with friends if you find it useful. Please subscribe to this channel if you like this type of deep analysis, because I truly believe we need to be having these conversations, because learning about the past helps us understand how we got to the present, as well as where we're going in the future. And those are difficult conversations, and it requires a lot of critical thinking. And this is one example of the type of work that can be done.